December 27, 1979, 7:15 in the evening. Kabul, Afghanistan. Hafizullah Amin, the man who had just murdered his way to becoming the leader of Afghanistan, is hosting a dinner party at his presidential palace. Soviet soldiers are guarding the gates. Soviet advisors are in the building. Soviet troops are at that very moment crossing the Afghan border by the tens of thousands. Amin is on the phone with Moscow, congratulating himself. Soviet forces are coming to help him, he says, to defend his revolution. He is confident. He is relaxed. He has no idea that the cola he was served earlier was poisoned. He has no idea that 560 Soviet Special Forces soldiers are surrounding his palace right now. He has no idea that Moscow has already chosen his replacement. He has 43 minutes to live. And the country his killers are about to take over? It will consume the Soviet Union for the next 10 years and help bring down the most powerful communist empire in history. This is how it started, and why it was always going to end badly. To understand why the Soviets walked into Afghanistan in 1979, you have to understand what Afghanistan was and what it had always been. A crossroads, a graveyard, a place that empires enter with confidence and exit in ruins. The British tried to control it 3 times in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They failed every time. And they knew why. Afghanistan was not a nation in the Western sense. It was a patchwork of ethnic groups, tribes, clans, and valleys, each with their own loyalties, their own codes, their own ancient feuds. The mountains were not just a geographic feature, and they were a military reality. You could defeat an Afghan army in the valley. You could not defeat an Afghan fighter in the mountains where he was born. After World War II, a period of relative stability settled over the country under King Zahir Shah. Moderate reforms, international aid from both sides of the Cold War, Soviet engineers building roads in the north, American engineers building roads in the south, all of them living better in Kabul than they did back home. A small, educated urban middle class begins to emerge. Universities open in Kabul, and universities, as they do everywhere, become incubators for dangerous ideas. By the early 1960s, Kabul's campuses are producing 2 competing visions for Afghanistan's future, and they cannot coexist. On one side, Afghan communists, a tiny faction of urban elites and Soviet-trained army officers who see the transformation of the Soviet Central Asian republics and want that for Afghanistan. They form the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA. Among their founding members, Hafizullah Amin, Babrak Karmal, and Nur Muhammad Taraki. All 3 have contact with the KGB. On the other side, Afghan Islamists, educated men debating what a modern Islamic society should actually look like, inspired by Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, preaching a conservative but politically engaged vision of Islam. These 2 groups will spend the next 2 decades fighting for the soul of Afghanistan and drawing the superpowers into the middle of it. In 1978, the Afghan communists seize power in a coup that surprises everyone, including the Soviet Union. And within 18 months, their revolution is already collapsing so fast that Moscow faces an impossible choice: watch Afghanistan fall, or send in the army. In April 1978, the Afghan communists make their move. The trigger is almost accidental. Demonstrations at the funeral of a prominent communist leader, a government crackdown, arrests of PDPA leaders. But communist officers in the Afghan army have been waiting for exactly this moment. Tanks roll into Kabul. Jet fighters roar overhead. President Daoud and more than 1,000 of his followers are killed in fierce fighting. The Sour Revolution is complete. The PDPA is in power. Moscow is surprised. Washington is surprised. Both assume the other was behind it. Or in reality, the Afghan communists have done it themselves and immediately create a problem nobody asked for. Because the PDPA is not ready to govern. It is a fractious coalition of hardline ideologues who believe that centuries of Afghan tribal culture, Islamic tradition, and rural social structure can be bulldozed away by decree. Land reform, forced redistribution, women's education mandated by government order in villages where such things have never existed. And for anyone who resists, mass executions, torture, imprisonment. The Soviet Union, which has spent decades carefully cultivating influence in Afghanistan, watches in horror. These are not the measured strategic communists Moscow was hoping for. These are fanatics who are setting the country on fire and calling it socialism. A KGB chief, Yuri Andropov, puts it bluntly to the Politburo. The PDPA is executing innocent people, alienating the population, and creating the very instability it was supposed to end. He warns against deeper involvement. Afghanistan is too underdeveloped, too tribal, too resistant to the kind of top-down transformation the PDPA is attempting. But events are already moving faster than Moscow can manage. In March 1979, the city of Herat erupts. An entire Afghan army division mutinies rather than fire on protesters. The uprising spirals into a massacre. Soviet civilian advisors and their families are hunted down and killed. The government crushes the rebellion at a cost of somewhere between 3,000 and 25,000 dead. A terrified Taraki calls Moscow. The government controls almost nothing outside Kabul. The army is deserting. But the Mujahideen, Islamic fighters backed by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and quietly the United States, now control most of the countryside. If Herat falls, he says, the revolution is finished. Inside the Kremlin, the argument about Afghanistan grows louder and more desperate through 1979. The Politburo is not a room full of idealists. These are Cold War veterans who understand geopolitics in terms of buffer zones, spheres of influence, and dominoes. Afghanistan borders Soviet Central Asia. It borders Iran, which has just undergone an Islamic revolution that terrifies Moscow. Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISE, is actively training and arming the Mujahideen. The United States is funding them. Losing Afghanistan to even indirect American influence is, to the Politburo's thinking, unacceptable. But the situation on the ground is deteriorating faster than anyone expected, and it is being made worse by the PDPA's own internal destruction. In September 1979, Taraki tries to have his protege Amin killed. Amin escapes, murders Taraki with a pillow, and takes power. Moscow despises Amin. They hold him responsible for the massacres. They are suspicious of him because he spent time studying in the United States. And when Amin begins quietly signaling to Washington that he wants improved relations, the KGB convinces itself, incorrectly, that he might be a CIA asset. By December, even the skeptics are moving toward intervention. KGB chief Andropov, who spent months warning against it, now argues that a limited military deployment could stabilize Afghanistan, replace Amin with the more moderate Karmal, and allow a quick withdrawal. The plan is for 6 months. The Soviets will come in, show force, prop up the new government, and leave. At the final Politburo meeting on December 12th, the Soviet chief of the General Staff stands up and warns against it. "We will alienate the entire Muslim East and suffer political damage globally," he says. Andropov cuts him off. Focus on military matters. Leave political decisions to us. The vote is taken. The invasion is approved. And so is Operation Storm 333. The plan to eliminate Amin before the first Soviet tank crosses the border. What happens next is one of the most audacious special operations of the Cold War. 560 Soviet soldiers against 2,500 Afghan defenders, a presidential palace on a fortified hill, and a mission that has to succeed in under an hour, or the entire invasion is compromised. The Soviets have been preparing for weeks. Their secret weapon is the Muslim Battalion, Soviet soldiers from Central Asian republics, chosen to look more familiar to locals, wearing Afghan army uniforms, deployed to Kabul officially to protect Amin. In reality, they are the tip of the spear. 2 KGB teams, Zenit and Grom, plus a company of air assault troops complete the assault force. In total, 560 men against the 2,500 defenders of the Tajbeg Palace. The Tajbeg is not an easy target. It sits on a hill. The surrounding area is mined, and 3 dug-in T-54 tanks cover the approaches. Afghan army barracks and anti-aircraft guns ring the perimeter. The assault plan divides the Soviet force into 12 groups with distinct assignments. Neutralize the tanks, storm the palace from the main road, outflank from the west, suppress the surrounding Afghan units, and destroy the anti-aircraft positions with Shilka radar-guided weapons. The first attempt to kill Amin is almost farcical. KGB agents poison his cola at dinner. It doesn't work. Amin collapses, but his own Soviet-supplied doctors revive him, not knowing what they're treating. He survives. At 7:15 p.m., a general alert goes up at the palace. The failed poisoning has put Afghan forces on edge. Soviet Colonel Kolesnik has no choice. He orders the general assault to begin immediately. The opening minutes are brutal. Afghan troops hit several Soviet armored vehicles. BG-2 loses multiple BMPs in the first exchange of fire. The assault troops continue on foot, reaching the palace gates at 7:40 p.m. The fighting inside is savage and close. Doors are kicked in. Grenades are thrown into rooms without warning. Soviet soldiers advance floor by floor in a building where every corner could hide a defender. BG-3, approaching from the west, takes losses crossing open ground before the Shilkas provide cover. By the time Soviet troops reach the upper floors, they are down to 50 men. They find Amin. He is killed along with his 2 sons. The operation lasts 43 minutes. At least 9 Soviet soldiers are dead. Some accounts say far more. Around 200 Afghans are killed. Nearly every participant in Storm 333 receives a military decoration, and its commander, Colonel Kolesnik, is made a hero of the Soviet Union. The assault will become a case study taught at Russian military academies for decades, a model of combined special operations, sabotage, disinformation, and direct action executed simultaneously. Its legacy reaches forward in time, into how Russia thinks about rapid, deniable military intervention. While Storm 333 is unfolding, the larger invasion is already in motion. On Christmas Day, 1979, the first Soviet columns cross the Afghan border. 2 pincers advance along the Ring Road, the same road the United States and Soviet Union had jointly funded years earlier. Soviet airborne forces secure Kabul's airport. Military transports land 7,700 men, nearly 900 vehicles, and over 1,000 tons of ammunition in the first wave. Within 72 hours, the Soviet Union has installed a new Afghan leader, secured the capital, and begun what it believes will be a 6-month stabilization mission. The next day, Babrak Karmal broadcasts a pre-recorded message from Kabul, promising to end the executions, unite the PDPA, and rebuild the country. He is lying about one thing already. Even as the broadcast airs, Amin's closest followers are being executed. The Afghan reaction is immediate. Within weeks, 430,000 Afghans flee to Pakistan. The international reaction is equally swift. The United Nations condemns the invasion. President Jimmy Carter announces the Soviet Union will face consequences. His national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, recognizing that the Mujahideen are disorganized and underfunded, begins dramatically expanding American support. Channeling money and weapons through Pakistan's ISI Saudi Arabia, seeing the Soviets at the edge of the Middle East, matches American funding dollar for dollar. The ISI becomes the conduit for a billion-dollar covert war that will arm, train, and sustain the Mujahideen for the next decade. The Soviets planned for 6 months. They will stay for 9 years. When they finally withdraw in 1989, 15,000 Soviet soldiers are dead. More than 1 million Afghans have been killed. 5 million have fled as refugees. The economic cost of the war, combined with the Reagan administration's deliberate strategy of forcing the Soviets to bleed, contributes directly to the economic collapse that tears the Soviet Union apart 2 years later. Historians still argue about the Soviet decision to invade. The most honest answer is that it was a choice made under pressure, with incomplete information, by men who believed their past successes made this manageable. The Soviets had intervened in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in Ethiopia, in Angola. Each time it had worked. Why not Afghanistan? What they missed, what every outside power that has ever entered Afghanistan has missed, is the difference between defeating an army and pacifying a people. The Soviet military could destroy any Afghan force it engaged. It could take any city, any valley, any pass. What it could not do was make Afghans stop fighting. The mountains that had broken the British Empire were just as steep in 1979 as they had been in 1842. The tribal networks that made insurgency self-sustaining were just as deep. And unlike the PDPA's urban base, the Mujahideen had something the communists never managed to build: genuine popular legitimacy. They were fighting for God, for their land, for their families, against an occupying power that had just installed its third government in 2 years at gunpoint. Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko had warned about this at the March Politburo meeting before the invasion was finalized. Who will the Soviet army fight against? Against the Afghan people first and foremost. Everything we created in terms of détente and arms control, all of that will be thrown back. He was right about every word of it. The invasion that was meant to last 6 months lasted 114. The Soviet-Afghan War is one of the defining events of the late Cold War, and one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. And it bled the Soviet military. It drained the Soviet economy. It shattered the image of Soviet invincibility in the developing world. And it created, in the Mujahideen networks that were armed and funded to fight it, the conditions for a different kind of radicalism that would reshape global politics for the next 4 decades. The men who made the decision in December 1979 believed they were making a limited, defensive move to protect Soviet interests. They were wrong. Not because the military plan failed, but because no military plan survives contact with a country that has been defeating outside powers for 2,000 years. The British learned that lesson. The Soviets learned it. And 30 years after Soviet troops withdrew from Kabul, American soldiers would cross the same mountain passes, certain, as everyone before them had been, that this time would be different. it never is. If this story hit you, share it. Because understanding how empires fall is the only way to understand the world we're living in right now. Thank you for watching.